She planned the perfect birthday dinner, paid the bill, baked his favorite cake, even wore the jacket he once said made her look too loud. But then she overheard her own son say 7 words that cracked something deep inside her. She's just too embarrassing to bring around. What followed wasn't a meltdown. It was a quiet unraveling, a silent return. And what this mother did next wasn't about revenge, was about remembering who she used to be. Before she shrank, to fit inside someone else's comfort. If you've ever felt erased by the ones you love most, this story will stay with you. It was supposed to be a celebration. A quiet dinner at that little fusion place on Main Street, his favorite. The one with the pressed linens and the string lights strung above the patio like stars that had agreed to hang around for just one more night. I had called ahead, made the reservation, even asked if they could accommodate the cake he liked. Red velvet with cream cheese frosting. No sprinkles, no writing on top, just clean and simple, like he preferred. I arrived early to tip the hostess and place the gifts at the end of the table. Nothing flashy. A leather-bound planner he'd mentioned needing, and a pair of cufflinks shaped like tiny compasses. Because I thought maybe he needed some direction. I was wrong. They all arrived together. My son, arms slung casually over the back of a chair as he leaned in to greet his friends, 3 of them. Loud and smiling, wearing that sheen of early success that young men in their late 20s seem to wear before they've figured out who they really are. I stood to greet them. One of them nodded politely. Another gave me that small, distant smile people reserve for store clerks and substitute teachers. My son kissed my cheek, said, "Thanks for doing all this, Mom," without really making eye contact. Then he was back in their orbit. I excused myself to the restroom just before drinks arrived. Not because I needed to go, but because I had learned when to disappear. I was walking back toward the table quietly when I heard it. "She's just too embarrassing to bring around." The voice was familiar, casual, like it wasn't meant to sting, like it wasn't meant to be heard, but I heard it. My son's voice. I stopped mid-step, still shielded by the corner of the hallway. I couldn't see their faces, but I could hear the soft rustle of a napkin being folded, the clink of ice in a glass, the faint chuckle of one of his friends in response. "Yeah, she means well, but it's just, another voice joined. My mom's the same. Starts talking to waiters like she's known them for years. She gets so into stuff. Like everything has to be a big sentimental thing." My son added. I stood there for a moment, back against the wall, arms slack at my sides. It was the tone that landed hardest. Not rule, not mocking, just ... dismissive. Like I was a recurring inconvenience, an outdated accessory he hadn't figured out how to leave behind yet. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my blouse, and walked back to the table. No one noticed the difference in my face. Maybe I was good at hiding it. Maybe they just weren't looking. Dinner continued. The server brought appetizers. My son made a toast, short and offhanded. "To good company," he said, raising his glass without glancing my way. The others clinked their glasses. I sipped quietly and smiled, because that's what mothers do. Or at least, what I had always done. The evening unfolded like a script I hadn't written. Stories I didn't understand. Jokes I wasn't meant to be part of. I laughed when appropriate, nodded when expected. But something had shifted. I could feel it behind my ribs. Not anger. Not even pain. Just distance. Like I'd been quietly moved to the edge of a photo frame. When dessert arrived, it's a small candle flickering atop that clean red velvet slice. I clapped softly with the rest. My son smiled at the waitress. "Thanks," he said, and she smiled back. I watched them, 2 strangers connected by a transaction. I realized I felt more kinship with her than with him. He didn't know I'd heard. Not that night. Not ever. I never told him. I never asked him what he meant, or why it felt so easy for him to reduce me to something inconvenient. But from that night on, I carried his words like a pebble in my shoes, small enough to ignore if I walked carefully. but always there, always pressing against my every step. I sat at that table for almost 2 hours, and not once did I let my face betray what I'd heard. The candlelight flickered softly across the linen, casting shadows that danced around our plates and wine glasses. I focused on keeping my hands steady. I reached for the breadbasket like everything was fine. I passed the butter like nothing had changed, but everything had. I watched my son laugh, leaning back in his chair with that easy, confident posture he'd adopted somewhere between college and forgetting who raised him. The sound of his voice used to be a kind of comfort. Oh, it sounded like a stranger's. I folded my napkin across my lap and nodded politely when someone told a story about a weekend in Palm Springs. I asked questions. I smiled. I even offered to split an appetizer with a friend sitting across from me. Though I didn't really want to eat anything at all, what I didn't say at the table was that I'd heard him. That the words, "she's just too embarrassing to bring around" were still circling my ears, still ringing like a wine glass tapped too hard. I didn't ask why he thought I was embarrassing. Was it my clothes, my voice, the way I complimented the server's earrings? Was it the way I reminded him of a past he was trying to shed like an old coat? I didn't ask if he remembered all the nights I stayed up helping him build science fair volcanoes and rehearse debate arguments. I didn't ask if he remembered how I sat through every game, even when he only played 5 minutes, clapping like he was the MVP. I didn't ask if he remembered that it was my voice that told him he could do anything. That it was me who told him the world didn't get to define his worth. I didn't say any of that. Instead, I poured him another glass of wine when his was low. I passed around the salad. I laughed softly when someone joked about being too old to stay out past 10. I bit down on the inside of my cheek and forced myself not to cry because I knew it would only make it worse. Because if I cried, I would be confirming what he said, that I was too much, that I felt things too deeply, that I couldn't just let things go, but I didn't let it go. I couldn't. Not really. I noticed the little things that night. The way he spoke more to his friends than to me. The way he leaned toward them but angled away from me. The way he never once asked if I was enjoying myself. I wasn't surprised. I had started to notice it months ago, the slow fade. It showed up in the way he'd text instead of call. The way Tanya always made excuses for why I couldn't be included. The way Mom had quietly been replaced with her in so many conversations. I felt it even as I smiled through dessert, even as I handed the server my card and waved away my son's half-hearted offer to split the bill. I had paid for everything. I always did. Birthdays, holidays, emergencies. I was the safety net that never asked for thanks. And still it was clear I'd become more useful than loved, more tolerated than wanted. At the end of the night, I hugged him goodbye. He smelled like cologne and beer. He patted my back quickly and turned away before I could say anything. I stood for a moment longer, watching him disappear into the night. With his friends, his laughter echoing down the sidewalk. I drove home in silence. No music, no podcast. Just the low hum of tires on pavement and the weight of all the things I hadn't said. The things I wished he already knew. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Not out of obligation. There was no school lunch to pack, no soccer practice to drive to. Those years were long gone, but my body, trained by decades of mothering, still stirred early. I sat at the edge of the bed for a while, the blanket pulled at my waist, my hands resting in my lap like they were waiting for instructions. I didn't cry. I just sat, and then I got up, put on the kettle, and made tea. Peppermint. The one I used to drink in the evenings when he was a baby and wouldn't fall asleep unless I held him against my chest. I'd rock him for hours, humming the same off-key lullaby, one I made up on the spot. I don't think he remembers that, but I do. That's the thing about motherhood. We carry the whole story. Not just the parts they remember, but all the pieces they've long since dropped, like breadcrumbs, tiny things. Things they forgot we noticed. He probably doesn't remember the yellow rain boots he refused to take off for a year straight. Or the time he stood in the kitchen at age 6 and said, "I'm going to marry you one day, Mama," with such certainty I almost believed he could. He doesn't remember the way he used to beg me to stay one more minute at bedtime, or how he'd reach for my hand in movie theaters without looking. But I remember the birthday party where none of the other parents showed up to help. So I ran the games, cut the cake, and cleaned up, all while keeping a smile plastered on my face. I remember waiting in the car outside his high school dance, watching through the windshield as he laughed with friends. He had asked me not to come in, not to walk him up to the door. "You don't have to wait," he'd said. "Just drop me off." But I waited anyway, just in case. There's a drawer in my hallway filled with things he probably assumes I've long thrown out. Finger-painted cards, written notes, a crayon portrait of me with wild orange hair, and a Cape's second-grade masterpiece titled "My Mom Saves the Day." I kept it all, because somewhere along the way we started living in different versions of the same story. His version lately edits me down to the most visible parts: my clothes, my voice, my presence. But my version, mine, holds everything. The scraped knees I bandaged. The math homework I stayed up late to help with, even when I barely understood it. The quiet nights when he was sick and I sat beside his bed counting breaths. They forget because they can. They move on. They grow up. They build new lives, new stories. And somewhere in that forward motion, some of them leave us behind. Not out of cruelty, not even consciously. It's just ease. It's easier to forget where you came from then. To admit how much of yourself is built from it. That morning after tea, I walked into the small storage room off the hallway. I opened the box labeled Nathan. Inside, years collapsed into layers. The tulip-shaped clay bowl he made in art class. The concert ticket from the first show he ever went to without me. His baby blanket, now worn thin and soft. The satin edges unraveling. I ran my hand over each item like I was reading Braille. This was my language. The one they don't speak anymore. The one of peanut butter sandwiches cut into stars of handmade. Halloween costumes of whispered encouragement before spelling bees. It made me wonder how many of us are living museums of the people our children no longer remember being. They forget the little things, but we don't. And sometimes what hurts most isn't what they say. It's what they don't even know they've left behind. The word kept circling my mind like a low buzz behind everything I did. It's embarrassing. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't spat. It was almost whispered, like something fragile. And that made it worse. There's a particular kind of sting in knowing someone doesn't even hate you. They just don't want you around. I set the breakfast table out of habit the next day, even though no one was coming. Laid out a napkin, spoon, and teacup like I used to when he was little. I let the toast sit in the toaster too long. It burned. I didn't remake it. Embarrassment is a funny thing. It doesn't always arrive when you think it will. It doesn't always come with laughter or eye rolls. Sometimes it shows up quietly when someone cuts you off mid-sentence, or lowers their voice when introducing you, or says she means well. Like you're an apology in human form. I remembered a birthday party from years ago. Nathan was. Maybe 9, maybe 10. He had wanted a magician. I booked the best one I could afford. I stayed up late the night before, hanging decorations and packing gift bags. When the magician pulled him up for a trick, Nathan was beaming. I clapped loudly, too loudly, I guess. Some of the kids laughed, not at him, but at me. I was wearing a silly party hat. I remember his face changing, just a little. That's when I first felt it, that shift. The beginning of a divide I couldn't name yet. He never asked for a magician again after that. Later, in high school, he started asking me to drop him off 2 blocks from the front entrance. It's just easier. He'd say less traffic. But there was no traffic. I knew that. Still, I said nothing. I wanted to give him space. Independence? I told myself it was normal, but now, looking back, I can see the trail. All the little signs I ignored, the slow undoing of closeness. Like a sweater unraveling thread by thread. I let him pull away because I believed it was temporary. That one day he'd see me fully again. That maybe when he had kids of his own, he'd remember the texture of my love. The weight of all the things I did quietly. Instead, I became something to manage. A presence to soften with boundaries. A voice to lower in public. A topic to avoid when friends were around. I remembered a conversation once when he was in college. He had brought home a girl he was dating, and I made my usual spaghetti, the kind I'd always made when he needed comfort. She smiled politely, but didn't eat much. After she left, he said, "Mom, maybe next time. Just something simpler." Like pizza, I nodded. I didn't argue. But that night, I stood in the kitchen, holding the pot I'd scrubbed by hand for 20 years and felt something slide quietly out of reach. Embarrassment has a long memory because it attaches itself to the places we were once proudest. I had given so much. I had stood front row at recitals, cheered in gymnasiums, clapped through off-key solos, baked for fundraisers. Not to be seen, but to support. And now, somehow, that very visibility was the thing he wished away. I wasn't loud. I wasn't crude. I didn't dress in costumes or dye my hair pink. I was just ... me. But apparently, being me had become too much. That morning, I poured the tea. I sat with the burnt toast. And I whispered the word one more time to myself. Embarrassing. It didn't feel like a description. It felt like a verdict, but a small part of me, somewhere between the aching and the remembering, started to ask, what if being embarrassing only meant refusing to disappear? And what if I wasn't ashamed of that anymore? Before they started, calling it too much my voice, my laugh, my questions, I was something else entirely. I was vibrant. I was bold without apology. I wore color like armor, and I danced to songs I didn't know all the words to. I made jokes that sometimes landed and sometimes didn't. But I made them anyway, because silence always felt heavier than laughter. I wasn't always this version of myself. The one who checks her tone before speaking, who rereads texts before sending them, who wonders if every gesture will be misunderstood. That came later. That came after years of shrinking myself 1 inch at a time to fit into the corners they left for me. I used to be the kind of woman who would stop to compliment a stranger's dress, who would learn a waitress's name and ask how her shift was going, not because I wanted attention, but because kindness was my language. Connection was my instinct. It still is. But somewhere along the way, that became ... inconvenient. I thought back to my 20s before motherhood wrapped itself around me like a second skin. I was working at the library back then. I organized poetry readings and kept a small journal in my purse for snippets of things I overheard. I wore skirts with loud prints and oversized earrings that swayed when I laughed. James used to call me his sunbeam. He said I lit up rooms without trying. After Nathan was born, I shifted gladly. I became a mother in every cell of my body. I packed lunches with handwritten notes. I made dinosaur-shaped pancakes. I stood in PTA meetings and asked the hard questions no one else would. I clapped too loud, yes. But I clapped because I believed in celebrating loudly. I believed in showing up without reservation. And for years, that was enough. I was enough. But I don't know exactly when that changed. Maybe it was when Tanya came into the picture. Polished, restrained, quiet in the way some people confuse. With elegance, she didn't laugh as much. She preferred minimalist decor and birthdays at trendy restaurants where the menus didn't list prices. She said things like, "Your mom's just very expressive," as if it were a flaw. Nathan started echoing that word, expressive, like I was a malfunctioning radio. It's always tuned a little too loud. I started second-guessing myself. Should I have worn something more neutral? Was my story too long? Did I hug too tightly? I became? careful, and carefulness was never my way. I was the woman who once painted her kitchen cabinets bright turquoise because it made her feel alive. I was the woman who sang in the car even when the windows were down. I was the woman who cried openly when she saw her son graduate, mascara streaking down her cheeks without shame. That woman didn't vanish. She just stepped back, folded herself into something more acceptable, less obvious. She tried to make space for their comfort, and in doing so, she slowly erased her own. But now I was beginning to remember her, not out of defiance, to prove anything, but because there is a kind of grief that comes from abandoning yourself to please others. And I had been grieving silently for years. I looked at an old photo that afternoon, one from a trip James and I took to Santa Fe. I was wearing a red scarf and no makeup. My hair was wild from the wind, my smile unfiltered. I was holding a cup of hot chocolate and laughing at something just out of frame. James had taken it without me knowing. He said it was the most me photo he'd ever captured. I stared at it for a long time. That woman wasn't gone. She was just waiting for me to remember that I was never the embarrassment. I was the color, the warmth, the story worth telling, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to tell it again. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even new. I found it 3 summers ago at a second-hand boutique tucked behind the farmer's market, half hidden. It's the kind of place you only found if you were walking slowly. The jacket was loud in the best way. Floral brocade, deep navy with gold threading, lined with silky red fabric that whispered when I moved. It fit like it had been waiting for me. I remember slipping it on and laughing out loud in the dressing room, not because it was funny, but because it felt so much like me, the version of myself I hadn't seen in a while. I wore that jacket the night of Nathan's birthday dinner. I had planned the evening down to the details, confirmed the reservation, checked the forecast, laid out the gift bag the night before. And when it came time to dress, I reached for the jacket without hesitation. Tanya once told me, offhandedly, that I dressed like a greeting card. She said it with a smile, as if it were a compliment. It wasn't. She wore neutrals clean, lines, fabrics that didn't wrinkle or speak. Her beauty was the kind that didn't move when she laughed. I, on the other hand, moved too much, laughed too loud, and apparently dressed like a celebration that had forgotten to end. I wore the jacket anyway, 'cause I had spent too many years choosing quiet, beige sweaters, safe shoes, things that made me easy to overlook, but not that night. That night, I wanted to feel like myself again, not for Nathan, not for Tanya. For me, the moment I walked into the restaurant, I saw it happen. The quick glance, the small reflexive smile he gave when he saw me, and then the shift. A flicker behind his eyes. His jaw tensed slightly, just for a moment. Tanya leaned toward him and said something under her breath. I couldn't hear it, but I didn't need to. I'd seen that look before. The kind that said, why does she have to make everything about her? I didn't say a word. I just pulled my chair out and sat down throughout dinner. I caught glimpses of it. My jacket, the way it drew eyes when I turned, the way it caught the light when I reached for the bread basket. Tanya didn't look at it directly. She never did. She glanced near it, around it, like it was a bright light she didn't want to acknowledge, but I wore it proudly. It was stitched with more than fabric. It held pieces of me they had chosen not to see. The girl who once wanted to be an actress, the woman who learned to sew her own clothes because she couldn't afford department store brands, the mother who used to drape a red tablecloth around her shoulders and run through the backyard pretending to be a superhero because Nathan once asked her if moms could fly. That jacket carried more memories than they knew. It wasn't just clothing. It was a reminder that I had not always been reduced to the role of the silent supporter. That once I had been vibrant and visible, not in the margins, but at the center. And if they found that embarrassing now, that was no longer my burden to carry. After dinner, as we said our goodbyes in the parking lot, Nathan leaned in, kissed my cheek, and said, "Thanks, Mom, for everything." His eyes barely met mine. I smiled, but I didn't say, "You're welcome." Instead, I just adjusted the collar of my jacket, turned toward my car, and let the fabric catch the wind. Because if I was going to be remembered as too much, then I would choose what too much meant, and I would wear it. Every stitch, every thread, every memory. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with a name tag that read Alina and a smile that tried to reach everyone at the table. But it faltered just a little when she turned toward me. Not out of discomfort, but because she saw what the others didn't. I don't know what gave it away. Maybe it was the way I kept folding and unfolding my napkin, or the way I poured water into my glass without drinking it. Maybe it was just something in my eyes. Alina took our drink orders with practiced cheer, leaning in slightly as the younger crowd bantered and talked over each other. My son barely acknowledged her. Tanya didn't even look up. But when Alina reached me, she paused, not long, not dramatically, just enough to offer a real smile. "I like your jacket," she said softly, and with no hint of sarcasm. I looked up. Our eyes met. It was a small moment, but I remember it clearly because it was the first time that evening I felt seen. Not as the woman who paid the bill, not as the one who arranged the dinner, just as a person, whole, present. "Thank you," I replied. "It has a little history." She smiled again. "The best clothes always do." No one else at the table noticed our exchange. Akala was halfway through a story about a work presentation, and his friends were laughing too loudly at a joke I hadn't caught. Tanya was scrolling through her phone beneath the tablecloth, her thumb moving quickly across the screen. But Alina saw me. Throughout the evening, she returned with refills, fresh silverware, and calm efficiency. But each time she came near me, she offered a kindness the others had not, a quiet patience. A glance that said, "I see how they talk over you. I see how they pretend you're not here." At one point, as she cleared a plate, she leaned slightly and whispered, "You've got a calm way. It's nice." I almost cried, not because of the words, but because someone had spoken to me without assuming I was in the way, without speaking down or around or past me. Later, when Tanya made a passing comment about the wine being a bit off and asked for something more refined, Alina didn't flinch. She nodded, replaced it, and continued with grace. I watched the entire thing, the composure, the slight tightening of her jaw, the way she knew how to move through small humiliations without reacting. And I realized something else. She wasn't just being kind. She recognized me, not personally, but in spirit. She had likely watched women like me before. Women who smiled too long at tables where no one asked them questions. Women who paid for everything but were treated like decorations. Women who stayed quiet to keep the peace, even when the silence grew sharp. She saw me because she knew me. Maybe not yet in years, but in intuition. As the night ended, she brought the check to my side of the table, not Tanya's, not Nathan's. She folded it gently and placed it beside my water glass. "No rush," she said. There was something respectful in the way she said it, not the scripted warmth of customer service. It felt like acknowledgement. A tiny bow. I signed the slip, leaving a generous tip. And before I handed it back, I wrote something small beneath my signature. "Thank you for seeing me." Wasn't much, but it was something, because in a night filled with invisibility, one stranger had managed to make me feel real again. And sometimes, one person noticing you even briefly is enough to remind you that you were never the one who failed to shine. You were just surrounded by people who forgot how to look. It was folded neatly in my purse on a card I had selected from the small stand by the bookstore register. It wasn't fancy, just cream-colored with a gold border. It's the kind that felt simple, timeless. I had handwritten it the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with my glasses perched low and the house quiet around me. I had gone over it twice, reading it aloud softly to make sure it sounded right. Not too long, not too sentimental, just enough to make him feel celebrated, just enough to remind him I was still here. I never read it. I sat through the entire meal with it burning in my bag like a small, glowing coal. I waited for the moment. The one where conversation slowed, where forks settled against plates and all eyes turned expectantly to me. That's how it always went in my head. A toast, a smile, a thank you. Few tears, maybe, if it landed right. But that moment never came. They didn't look to me for words. They looked past me. My son joked with his friends. Tanya narrated parts of their upcoming vacation plans, and the server came and went with dishes none of us finished. I waited. The toast opened with a memory. On the day Nathan was born, I remember thinking that the world had tilted just slightly, that somehow everything ordinary had become charged with light. He looked at me with those big eyes, and I knew I'd spend the rest of my life trying to make the world kinder for him. I had written that line because it was true. 'Cause that's how I felt when they first placed him in my arms. The next part was a little lighter. I'd included a story about him as a toddler, how he used to push his toy truck through every room of the house, telling everyone he was going to work, wearing a plastic firefighter's hat too big for his head, and then just one sentence about now. You're becoming a man with a life of your own. And I'm proud of the journey, even the parts I don't always understand. That was going to be my nod to the space between us. A gentle way of saying, I see the gap, but I still choose love. I had planned to raise my glass and end with, to the boy who once called me his best friend and the man I hope still remembers why. But that night when the candle was lit on his slice of cake and someone said, say a few words, man, my son raised his own glass and gave a 2-line toast about good company and making it through another year. Then he laughed, took a bite of cake. The moment passed. No one turned to me. No one asked if I wanted to say something, so I didn't. I smiled. I clapped. I took a small sip of wine and tucked the card deeper into my purse as if it might leak if I didn't seal it away. I told myself it didn't matter. That he probably wouldn't have wanted the attention, that it might have made things awkward. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't about the speech. It was about how invisible I had become in a room I built after dinner. While everyone lingered near the valet, I stood quietly off to the side. I could hear them laughing behind me. One of Nathan's friends was recounting a funny moment from college. Tanya was on her phone again. I opened my purse and felt the edge of the card. Just for a second. Then let it go. Some words never get said. Not because they aren't true, but because no one left room for them. And maybe that was the part that stung the most, not being silenced. But being completely unneeded, the toast would stay in my purse that night, folded and unread, like so many things I used to offer freely. The car ride home was only 18 minutes, but I remember every one of them. The way the headlights stretched out across the dark pavement like long, tired arms. The click of the turn signal. The steady thrum of the tires beneath us. The silence. Nathan sat in the passenger seat, his phone glowing in his hands. His thumbs moved quickly, pausing only to laugh at something on the screen, something I wasn't part of. Didn't notice I hadn't spoken since we pulled out of the parking lot. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just didn't ask. Photos sent after the fact. The group chats where I was only looped in for logistics, never memories. Still, there was a part of me that stirred. That small, foolish part of every mother that whispers, maybe this is the beginning. Maybe he's reaching out. Maybe he just doesn't know how to say more. But I had already carried the burden of making up the difference too many times, of pretending a small gesture was a grand apology, calling silence forgiveness. I looked out the window. The sun was soft that day, the kind of light that makes everything look more honest. It's poured across the kitchen floor like a quiet truth. And in that light, I could finally admit something. I didn't want crumbs anymore. I wanted the full loaf. I wanted the kind of love that didn't come with qualifiers or deadlines or obligations. The kind that didn't need prompting. I picked up the phone one last time. I didn't open the message again. I didn't craft a reply. I simply turned it off and placed it face down. Because sometimes the most powerful answer is no answer at all. Not out of cruelty, but because dignity doesn't negotiate with half efforts. And I was done negotiating later. I went for a walk. I passed the small park where I used to take Nathan when he was little. The swings creaked in the breeze. I stood by the fence for a while, watching a young mother chase her toddler through the grass. She laughed as she ran, her hair flying. Her arms outstretched, no embarrassment, no hesitation, just joy. I smiled. I remembered what that felt like, and I walked home slowly, the breeze light on my back. My phone silent in my pocket. The text would remain unread, because I wasn't waiting. Anymore, it wasn't meant to be anything special. No grand announcements, no dramatic gestures. It's just another evening with the same women who had sat with me in my truth and I in theirs. We met again a few weeks later. Same room, same table, different air. Lighter somehow. Not because anything had been fixed in the world outside, but because something had settled in us. I wore the same jacket. Not to make a point, but because it had become mine again. Not a costume, not a question. Part of who I was. Bold, soft, layered. The jacket I once considered a mistake had become a quiet kind of armor, familiar and strong. They arrived, with wine and laughter tucked under their arms. Denise brought a pie that didn't set properly. Frances brought the same bottle of wine she'd brought last time, forgetting she'd already tried it. Carol wore red lipstick for the first time in a decade. Why not? I said, her smile crooked but proud. We didn't talk about who hadn't called us. We didn't revisit the people who had made us feel like background noise. Instead, we talked about the things we used to love. Nora once dreamed of owning a bookstore. Louise had wanted to learn Spanish. Denise used to write poetry on napkins while waiting in the carpool line. These stories came easily now, like water after drought. Not rushed, not forced, just finally allowed to flow. There were no phones on the table. No one checked the time. No one filtered themselves for fear of being called dramatic. It was the kind of gathering where you laughed until your ribs hurt and didn't apologize for it. Where you could trail off in the middle of a sentence and someone else would pick up the thread, not to correct you, but to hold it with you. At some point in the evening, we started talking about photos. Frances pulled a small envelope from her. Bagel prints, frayed at the edges, but still clear. One of her on a fishing boat with her late husband. Another of her playing piano at 17, hair piled high, eyes full of mischief. She passed them around the table like they were pieces of a story she'd been waiting to tell. We all had them photos we never framed because no one asked to see them. Versions of ourselves we'd been made to feel embarrassed about. The too loud laugh, the too bold dress, the too young dream. I reached into my purse and pulled out the napkin I'd once kept in my wallet, then tucked away. The one Nathan had scribbled on as a boy. My mom is the reason I believe in magic. I hadn't shown it to anyone in years. I passed it to Nora, who read it aloud, slow and careful, as if it were poetry. Silence followed. Not heavy this time. Reverent. Then Denise spoke, her voice low but certain. He still believes that. He just forgot how to say it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because maybe she was right, or maybe not. But the truth was, I know. Longer needed him to say it. That napkin held more than his words. It held a time when I believed them. 2 up to dinner. We sat on the patio, the evening air wrapping around us like a soft shawl. We sipped tea and watched the sky slip into its quieter shades. I thought, this is what belonging feels like. No explanations, no edits. Just being. That night, when the women hugged goodbye, they held me longer than politeness required. Each of them whispered some version of thank you. Not just for the dinner, but for making space, for remembering, for inviting them not just to the table, but back to themselves. As I cleared the dishes, I moved slowly, deliberately. I traced the rim of each plate, wiped the candle wax from the cloth, and folded the linen napkins not to pack them away, but to prepare for the next time, because there would be a next time. This wasn't a one-off act of defiance or comfort. It was a beginning. It's a quiet declaration that we would no longer wait to be seen. We would no longer ask for permission to be full. The story had been rewritten, not with arguments or apologies, but with presence. And this time, I was at the center of the page. It wasn't a revelation that came in one loud moment. There was no cinematic swell of music, no sudden flash of realization under a spotlight. It came slowly, quietly, like the feeling of warmth returning to your fingers after you've been out in the cold too long. It came in waves, in pieces. And one morning, as I watered the potted plant on my windowsill, its leaves curling toward the light without asking for permission, I finally said it aloud. I was never the embarrassment. I said it into the quiet house, into the early light, into the silence that once felt like punishment, but now felt like peace. I had spent so long measuring myself through the lens of other people's discomfort. Every story too long, every hug too tight, every bright color a question. I let myself believe that being big-hearted was a burden, that having opinions, having memories, having emotions that didn't sit down when asked those things made me wrong. But it wasn't me. It was never me. It was the rooms that had grown too small for my full self. The people who preferred a version of me that asked for nothing, said little, paid quietly, and smiled no matter how sharp the edges got. They called me too much, but I was never too much. I was the full measure. I looked around my home and saw it with new eyes. The framed photo of James on the bookshelf, the one where he's wearing that ridiculous Hawaiian shirt and holding up a fish he never caught. The stitched pillow on the chair that says, "Still here." The mug with a crack in it that I still drink from every morning. Everything I had once edited to be acceptable now felt like an archive. Of me, of joy, of history that didn't need to be rewritten to be honored. A few days later, I was standing in line at the post office when I saw a young mother crouched beside her child. He was having a moment, tiny fists clenched, tears welling, the kind of frustration only small children can have when the world doesn't make sense. She looked exhausted, embarrassed. The people around her shifted uncomfortably. Some sighed, others looked away. But I caught her eye and smiled. Not the condescending smile, the other kind. The one that says, "You're doing fine. He'll be okay. So will you?" She smiled back. And I saw it in her shoulders, that soft release. That moment of being seen without being judged. I had been that mother once, and I realized something else. That even when Nathan forgot the shape of my love, the world hadn't. He had called me embarrassing. But what he meant was, you love out loud. You show up even when you're asked to disappear. You make other people uncomfortable by being whole. In a room that only welcomes pieces, I was not the embarrassment. I was the example of consistency, of devotion, of how to keep showing up even after you've been made small, of how to find your way back to yourself, not with anger, but with clarity. That night, I sat at my table with a candle lit beside James's photo. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. Just sat, and I said thank you. Not to anyone in particular. Just to the version of me that had finally come home. To the woman who didn't stop writing birthday cards. Even when they went UNACKNOWLADGED. To the mother who stopped apologizing for having a voice. To the grandmother who still made keychains and little goodie bags, even if no one picked them up. To the woman who, when told she was too embarrassing, chose instead to become unignorable. I stood and walked to the kitchen, the candle flickering behind me. And as I reached for the kettle, the old wind chime James had hung outside caught the breeze. It rang not loudly, not insistently, just enough to be heard.